The first snow of the season came down soft and silent over Silver Bend, dusting the boardwalks white, when Jessie Coyle grabbed the lead rope of a blue roan mare right out of Olive Langley's gloved hand and laughed in her face. "This animal's got a toll owed on her," he said, showing yellow teeth beneath a mustache stiff with frost. "Silas Vance don't let fine stock cross his road for free, missy, and you know it." Olive's hand went to the pistol at her hip before she had even finished thinking the thought, the way her father had taught her since she was 12 years old and could outride every hand on the Langley range. She had the muzzle level with Coyle's chest from one end of the street before the mare had time to toss her head. From the other end of the street, past the mercantile and the leaning hitching rail, where the snow was already collecting in white ridges, a man in a canvas duster stepped clear of the boardwalk with his own revolver drawn and steady, and he was looking down the same barrel line at the same startled outlaw. "Let go of the rope, Coyle," Albert Kendrick said, in a voice that did not rise or shake despite the cold, despite the fact that he had two guns now pointed near him from opposite directions, and only one of them was his own. "You know good and well that horse belongs to Langley stock, and you got no paper says different." Coyle's eyes flicked from Olive to Albert and back, and for a moment the whole street of Silver Bend seemed to hold its breath along with him. The freighters paused mid-load. A woman with a basket of eggs frozen halfway across the road, an old miner leaning in the doorway of the assay office with his pipe forgotten between his teeth. "2 guns for 1 man," Coyle said at last, and though his mouth curled like he found that funny, his boots were already backing him toward his horse. "Mr. Vance will hear how Langley folk treat a friendly toll collector. Might be next time it ain't so friendly." He swung up into his saddle, spat once into the snow, and put his horse into a trot down the center of the street, scattering slush, until he turned the corner by the livery and was gone. Olive lowered her pistol slowly, her heart still going hard beneath her coat, and only then did she let herself really look at the man who had drawn down from the far end of the street on her behalf, or perhaps not on her behalf at all, perhaps only because he could not abide a man like Coyle laying hands on good stock. He was tall in that unhurried way some men were tall, with a face weathered brown by sun and wind, a few days of dark stubble, and eyes the color of good coffee that were, at the moment, studying her with the same frank assessment she was giving him. "You're quick with that iron," he said, holstering his own. "So are you," Olive answered, "though I had him first. Might be we both had him first from where we were each standing." A corner of his mouth tugged upward, not quite a smile, but close enough kin to one that Olive felt something small and unexpected turn over in her chest. "Albert Kendrick," he said. "I ride fence for the Langley spread, ma'am, though I don't suppose you'd know that, seeing as your father don't often walk the line himself." "I know exactly who rides my father's fence," Olive said, "on account of I sign half the pay vouchers myself. You're the one who wrote to complain about the North Section posts rotting through and got told to mind his own business for his trouble." Something flickered across his face, surprise maybe, or a kind of wary respect. "You read those, then?" "I read everything that comes across my father's desk when he's too occupied with his cattle contracts to be bothered," Olive said, and she took the mare's lead rope back into her own hand, patting the roan's neck where the animal had begun to settle. "Olive Langley," she added, though she suspected he already knew. "I know who you are, Miss Langley," Albert said. "Whole territory knows the cattle baron's daughter can outride any man on his payroll." He touched the brim of his hat, an old, practiced courtesy, and there was nothing mocking in it, only a kind of plain acknowledgement. "Best get that roan out of the weather. Snow's coming on harder than folks think." He was right. Even as he spoke, the flakes had thickened, softening the rutted street into something almost gentle, and Olive felt the first true chill of the season settle into her bones as she led the mare toward the livery, aware without quite wanting to be that Albert Kendrick's eyes followed her the whole way down the street. Word of the standoff reached Warren Langley before Olive did, carried on the tongue of every idler who had witnessed it, and by the time she walked into her father's study above the bank, he was already pacing, his silver-shot beard bristling with a fury she recognized from 100 cattle deals gone sour. "You drew a gun on Silas Vance's man in the middle of the street," he said, not as a question. "He was stealing our horse, Papa. He was collecting a toll I have been paying every month since spring so that our herds cross that road without a single animal lost to rustling or a single wagon burned," Warren said, and the words hung there in the lamplit room like something shameful finally spoken aloud. "You do not understand what it costs to keep this ranch running, Olive, and you certainly do not understand what it costs to anger a man like Vance in front of half the town." Olive stared at her father, feeling something like the floor tilt beneath her. "You've been paying him." "All this time. I have been keeping this family solvent," Warren said. "There's a difference, though I don't expect you to see it from where you're standing." It was into this argument that Albert Kendrick walked, summoned by one of the hands to account for his part in the street, and Warren Langley turned on him with the relief of a man who finally had somewhere safe to put his anger. "You drew on Vance's man in broad daylight," Warren said. "You've put this ranch in danger for the sake of one horse and your own pride, and I will not have a fence rider who thinks he can decide policy for me. You're finished here, Kendrick. Collect your pay from Prout and be off Langley land by morning." "Papa, that isn't fair," Olive started, but her father raised a hand, and Albert, for his part, only nodded once slow, as if he had expected nothing better. "You're the boss, Mr. Langley," he said. "Been proud to ride your fence these 3 years. Sorry it ends over a horse thief in the street, but I'd do the same again tomorrow." He looked once at Olive, something unreadable in his face, and then he was gone, boots echoing down the wooden stairs and out into the thickening snow. Olive stood in the sudden quiet of her father's study, watching the window fog with her own held breath, and felt for the first time in her 24 years a genuine and frightening doubt about the man who had raised her. The trouble was that the ranch could not survive on cattle prices alone that year, not with the market soft and half the northern buyers gone bankrupt after the winter before, and so it fell to the horses to save them. 11 matched Arabian cross geldings and mares that Warren Langley had spent 4 careful years breeding up from good Kentucky stock, crossed with hardy range mustangs, animals with the endurance of the frontier and the elegance the Army liked to see in its officers' mounts. The quartermaster at Fort Grant had agreed to a contract worth more than the entire fall cattle sale, provided the horses arrived sound and unmarked before the 15th of the month, delivered along the one safe road through the mountains before the high passes closed for winter. It was Olive who had bred them, gentled them, and it was Olive who insisted, over her father's initial objection, that she would be the one to deliver them, for she trusted no hired hand to read a spooked horse's ears the way she could, and she had ridden that mountain road herself a dozen times as a girl before the outlaws had claimed it as their own toll gate. "Take Prout and 2 of the boys," Warren said, softened now by worry rather than anger, 3 days after he had fired his fence rider. "I don't like you out on that road with Vance stirred up as he is." "Prout's never ridden Coldwater Gate in snow," Olive said. "Neither have the boys. If we lose a horse on that grade or get caught in a whiteout because none of us know where the shelf trail cuts off from the wash, we lose the whole contract and likely the ranch besides." "Then who," her father said, though he already seemed to guess the answer and did not care for it, "would you have instead?" Olive found Albert Kendrick 3 miles out of town, in a leaning line shack he had apparently claimed for himself since being let go, mending a broken stirrup strap by lamplight with the patient hands of a man who had nowhere pressing to be. He looked up when her horse's hooves crunched in the new snow outside, and did not seem surprised to see her. "Come to fire me twice, Miss Langley." "Come to hire you," Olive said, staying mounted, because it felt safer somehow to look down at him while she said it. "I need someone who knows Coldwater Gate and every wash and shelf trail around it, someone who can get 11 horses through the mountains before Vance's men or the snow gets to them first, whichever comes worse. My father fired you. I'm asking you separate from him, and I'll pay you separate from him too." Albert set down the stirrup strap slowly. "Your father made himself pretty clear about not wanting me on his payroll." "You wouldn't be on his payroll, you'd be on mine." Olive dismounted then, because it seemed foolish to keep hollering the offer down at him from horseback, and stood in the snow a few feet from the shack door, close enough to see the flicker of consideration in his eyes. "I know that road as a girl knows a road she rode with her mother 20 times before her mother died of the fever. I don't know it as a man who has driven every stage and led every posse through it for the better part of a decade, which is what I hear you did before you ever came to ride my father's fence line." Something passed behind his eyes at the mention of driving stage, quick and dark and gone again before she could name it. "That was a while back. Then you'll remember it well enough. Will you come, Mr. Kendrick?" He studied her a long moment, the lamp throwing gold across half his face and leaving the other half in shadow, and Olive found herself holding still under the weight of his consideration, in a way she was not accustomed to holding still for any man. "I'll come," he said finally, "on 2 conditions. I answer to you and nobody else on this drive, not your father, not Prout, not the army colonel himself till those horses are handed over. And you tell me straight, right now, why a man like Vance would care 2 cents about a string of cavalry horses. Because, in my experience, he don't bother himself with anything that isn't worth his particular trouble." Olive had not thought that far ahead, and she said so honestly, which seemed to satisfy him more than a confident lie would have. "Then we'll find out together," Albert said, and held out his hand, and when she shook it his grip was warm and sure despite the cold, and something in Olive Langley's chest, already unsettled since the moment on the street 3 days before, turned over once more and did not right itself. They set out 2 mornings later with the herd strung in a careful line behind Olive's own mare, 11 fine horses breathing white plumes into the cold, and 2 young hired hands named Tom Ryerson and a freckled boy, everyone simply called Cricket riding drag, to keep stragglers moving. Dale Prout, the ranch foreman, had made his opinion of the arrangement known loudly and often in the days before departure, muttering that a fired man had no business leading the Langley heir into the mountains. But Warren Langley, chastened perhaps by his daughter's cold silence at supper each night, had not overruled her, and so it was Albert Kendrick who rode point, reading the land the way another man might read a well-loved book. "You favor the near side rein too much," he told Olive on the 2nd hour, not unkindly, watching her handle a nervous young gelding that kept crowding the mare ahead of it. "Loosen up. He's not fighting you, he's asking you a question, and you keep answering him like he's fixing to bolt." "I've broke more horses than you've eaten breakfasts, Mr. Kendrick," Olive said, though she loosened the rein anyway and felt the gelding settle almost at once and did not enjoy how right he had been. "Didn't say you hadn't. Said you favor that rein." He grinned then, quick and real, the first true smile she had seen cross his face since the street in Silver Bend. "Ranch folks always think riding fence taught me nothing but how to string wire. Truth is a man learns more about a herd's temper watching it from outside the corral than he ever does breaking colts inside one." "Is that where you learned to read a road too, watching from outside it?" The grin faded, not into anger but into something more careful. "I drove stage on this very route for 6 years, Miss Langley. Tucson to Fort Grant up to Copper Flat and back, near enough every week God sent me. Knew every wash, every shelf trail, every place a wheel could break or a horse could founder. Knew it better than any man living, till the day Vance's outfit, or the outfit that came before Vance took it over proper, decided the mail box under my seat was worth more than my brother's life." Olive's breath caught. "Your brother rode with you. Shotgun guard. 19 years old, better shot than me, worse judge of danger, which is a poor combination for a man in that line of work." Albert's jaw tightened, and he looked ahead at the gray mountains rather than at her. "They hit us at the gate itself, where the road narrows down to that one bridge crossing. Sam went for his rifle instead of throwing up his hands, on account of he never could stand being told what to do by a man with a bandana over his face. They shot him off the box before he'd cleared the boot. I buried him at Fort Grant and never drove that road again, not for wages, not for anybody, until your father hired me on to ride fence, where the worst thing I had to face most days was a rattlesnake in a post hole. I'm sorry, Olive said, and meant it entirely, surprised by how much she meant it. I didn't know. No reason you would. He glanced sideways at her, and whatever hardness had come into his voice eased a little. Reason I tell you now is so you understand why I know this road the way I do, and why I mean to see these horses through it whole, and why, if Vance's men do come looking for us at Coldwater Gate, I won't be inclined to hand over so much as a horseshoe nail without a fight. They rode on through the widening afternoon, the snow that had started in Silver Bend having thinned to a pale winter light over the foothills, though Albert kept glancing at the northern sky with an expression Olive was learning to read as worry disguised as patience. Coyle's men, or men who might have been Coyle's men, showed themselves twice that first day. Once as riders on a distant ridge who watched the horse string pass and then vanished without approaching, and once as a pair of strangers loitering too casually at a fork in the trail where the safe route split from a lesser-used wash. Albert did not slow the herd for either sighting, but Olive noticed how he shifted his rifle from the saddle scabbard to lie loose across his lap, and how Tom Ryerson's freckled face had gone pale and watchful at the rear of the line. "They're counting horses," Albert said quietly, when the second pair of riders had faded from view behind them. "Vance will know exactly what we're carrying before we've gone 20 miles. Question is whether he decides to try for them on the road, or waits till we're bottled up someplace he can be sure of." "Coldwater Gate," Olive said. "Coldwater Gate," Albert agreed, "unless we're clever or lucky or both." That night the snow came down in earnest, thick, soft flakes that muffled every sound and turned the world outside the old line shack Albert led them to into a hushed gray nothing. It was a squat little building of stacked stone and sod roof, built decades before by some forgotten homesteader, and it had exactly one working stove and exactly one room, so that Olive found herself sharing close quarters with Albert Kendrick and 2 young cowhands, while the wind screamed thin and high outside, and the horses stamped in the makeshift rope corral they had strung between the shack and a stand of junipers. Tom and Cricket, exhausted from the day's ride, were asleep within the hour, curled near the stove like a pair of tired dogs, leaving Olive and Albert to sit across the small fire from each other in a silence that was not quite uncomfortable and not quite easy either. "You didn't have to come out here," Albert said finally, feeding a stick of dry mesquite into the stove. "Your father would have sent Prout regardless, and you could have stayed warm in Silver Bend. And let Prout lose a horse in a snowbank because he can't tell a shelf trail from a deer path." Olive shook her head. "Those horses are mine, Mr. Kendrick. I raised every one of them from a foal. I know which ones startle at shadows and which ones will follow a lead mare through fire if she asks them to. Nobody delivers them but me. That why you drew on Coyle in the street wasn't your father's honor you were defending. It was that roan mare's." Olive considered the fire a moment before answering. "Partly that. Partly I suppose I'm tired of being the cattle baron's daughter and nothing else. Everybody in that town knows my father's name before they know mine, and half of them think a woman who can rope and ride is some kind of curious animal to be admired at a distance and never actually trusted with anything that matters." She looked up and found him watching her with an attention that made her feel, oddly, both exposed and entirely safe. "You don't look at me that way." "No," Albert said simply. "I look at you like a woman who put a gun on a killer without her hand shaking, and who rode a mountain road in a snowstorm without a single complaint, and who talks about her horses the way most folks talk about their children. Don't see much reason to look at you any other way." Something in Olive's chest ached pleasantly at that, and she found herself asking, before she had quite decided to, "Why did you really take my father's fence-riding job after the stage?" "Seems a poor trade. town to town, driving down to checking Wire in the dirt. Wire don't shoot back, Albert said, and there was a wry, weary humor in it that told her he had made peace with the joke a long time ago, even if the making had cost him something. Fence lines quiet. A man can hear himself think out there. I'd had about enough of not thinking after Sam. He shrugged, an economical gesture. Didn't figure on ever drawing down on Vance's men again in this life. Funny how a woman defending her horse in the street can change a man's mind about that. I didn't ask you to change your mind. No, he agreed, and the corner of his mouth curved again in that almost smile she was coming to watch for. You didn't ask at all. I just went and did it anyway, on account of I couldn't much stand watching Coyle put his hand on something that plainly wasn't his to take. He looked at her then, steady and unhurried, the firelight catching the coffee dark of his eyes. Same as I couldn't stand it now if it came to that. They did not say anything more of consequence that night, but Olive lay awake long after the fire had burned low, listening to the wind and to the quiet, even breathing of the man across the small room, and thought that she had never in her life felt quite so unafraid of a storm. The morning brought clear skies and a swollen creek where 2 days before there had been only a shallow, easy ford, the snowmelt from higher elevations having turned it into a brown, churning hazard that Albert eyed with open displeasure. We cross slow, one at a time, lead ropes short, he told them all, dismounting to walk the bank and test the footing. Any horse goes down in that current, do not go in after it. You hear me, Tom? Cricket. Do not go in after it. It was, of course, Olive who went in after it, though not by choice. When the young gelding she had been coaxing along the day before spooked at a floating branch mid-crossing and reared, wrenching its lead free of her numb, cold-stiffened fingers and plunging sideways into the deeper current. She was off her own mare and into the water almost before she had decided to be, driven by some instinct deeper than sense, reaching for the gelding's trailing rope as the animal's head went under and came up again, eyes wild. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath clean out of her lungs, and the current was stronger than it had looked from the bank, dragging at her skirts and boots with a strength that frightened her more than she wanted to admit even as she closed her fist around the rope. Olive. Albert's voice cut across the water, and then he was in the creek too, ignoring every piece of his own advice, wading and then swimming the last few strides to reach her, one arm going around her waist while the other hauled at the gelding's rope alongside her own grip. Between the two of them and the horse's own desperate scrambling, they got the animal's feet back under it against the gravel bar, and then they were all three of them stumbling up onto the bank in a soaked, shivering tangle, the gelding blowing hard but sound, Tom and Cricket shouting encouragement from where they had held the rest of the string steady. I told you not to go in, Albert said when he had his breath back, still holding her against his side as if he had not quite decided to let go, both of them dripping and shaking with cold. You went in too. That's different. How is that different? Because, Albert said, and for once there was no wry humor in his face at all, only something raw and plain. I couldn't have stood on that bank and watched you drown, Olive Langley, and that is the whole and entire truth of it. They stood there a moment longer than was strictly necessary, close enough that Olive could feel the shudder of cold running through him same as through her, close enough that she thought, with a kind of dizzy clarity, that he might kiss her, and that she might let him, snow-soaked and half-frozen as they both were. But the gelding chose that moment to shake itself violently and stagger, and Olive's attention snapped back to the animal's welfare with the reflex of a lifetime's habit, and the moment passed, though it did not vanish. It only waited, the way certain things do, for a better time. They reached Halloran Station 2 days later, a low adobe building with a corral and a well that marked the last outpost before the trail climbed toward Coldwater Gate. And it was there that Ezra Halloran, a bent old man who had kept that lonely station for 20 years, gave them news that turned the whole shape of their errand. Vance's men been through here twice this week, Halloran said, pouring coffee with a hand that trembled slightly from age or old injury, talking loud about a shipment of army horses coming down from the Langley place. Seems your Mr. Coyle recognized that roan mare from the street business in Silver Bend and put two and two together quick enough. Vance means to meet you at the gate itself, take a toll he calls fair, which I expect means most or all of what you're carrying. And the marshal? Albert asked. Purdy send any word he means to do something about an outlaw fixing to rob an army contract in broad daylight. Halloran laughed, a short, bitter sound. Marshal Purdy takes his supper at Vance's expense twice a month regular, son. Has done for a year now. You go looking to him for help, you'll get about as much use as asking the fox to guard the henhouse. He shook his head. Ain't just Purdy, either. Territory road inspectors been paid to certify Coldwater Gate as the only legal route for Army freight, which means Vance controls the one road anybody's allowed to use, official-like, and everybody in 3 counties knows it and nobody dares say so out loud, for fear of what happens to their barns. Olive felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the creek 2 days behind them. My father's known this. He's been paying to keep our cattle drive safe. Your father and every other rancher who ships stock through this country, Halloran said, not unkindly. Ain't no shame in a man protecting what's his the only way the law allows him to, when the law itself has been bought out from under him. He glanced at Albert. Though I expect there's some here who'd argue the shame lies with Vance and Purdy both, not the men they've squeezed into paying. That night, while Olive sat up composing in her mind the words she would need to say to her father, Tom Ryerson came to her holding something he had found near the corral, dropped, he supposed, by one of the riders who had passed through days before. A small leather-bound ledger, water-stained but legible, filled with careful columns of dates and dollar amounts, and against several of the largest entries in a cramped hand, the initials A.P. Amos Purdy, Albert said. When Olive showed him the book by lamplight, his voice gone very quiet and very certain. That's the marshal's book, or a copy of it. Coyle must have been carrying it and dropped it without noticing, careless fool that he is. He turned the pages slowly, and Olive watched his face harden with each column of figures. This is proof, Olive. Proof enough to put in front of a territorial judge. Proof enough to show every rancher and merchant in Silver Bend that their marshal has been taking Vance's money to look the other way while decent folks get robbed on the only road they've got. Then we go back, Olive said. We show this to my father and to the newspaper and to every man in town who's been too afraid to say Vance's name above a whisper. And the horses. The contract deadline gives us until the 15th. We have time to go back, raise what noise we can, and still make the crossing. Olive closed the ledger carefully, as if it were something fragile, though she suspected it might prove to be the sturdiest thing they carried. I won't let Vance take these horses, Albert, but I won't let him go on ruling this road unchallenged either, not now that we can prove what he's bought. Albert looked at her for a long moment, and there was something in his expression that had not been there before, admiration mixed with a kind of aching hope he seemed almost afraid to let show. All right, he said. We go back. Silver Bend received them with the particular hush of a town that has already heard half a story and is hungry for the rest of it. And Olive did not wait even to change out of her travel-stained coat before she walked into the offices of the Silver Bend Sentinel and laid the ledger on the desk of its editor, a sharp-eyed woman named Constance Whitfield, who had run the paper alone since her husband's death 2 winters before. This is Marshal Purdy's hand, Constance said, after a long, careful reading, her mouth thinning into a hard line. These dates match the very weeks half the ranchers in this valley have been complaining about missing stock and burned wagons that Purdy claimed he couldn't find a single suspect for. She looked up at Olive with something like fierce satisfaction. This will run in tomorrow's edition, Miss Langley, with your name attached if you'll allow it, because a story like this needs a face the town trusts behind it, and yours is a name that carries weight even now. It carried weight indeed, though not entirely the kind Olive had hoped for. By noon the next day, half of Silver Bend was arguing in the street outside the Sentinel's office, some furious at Purdy, others furious at Olive for airing what they called family business better handled quietly. And by that evening, Marshal Amos Purdy himself arrived at the Langley Ranch house with 2 deputized men and a warrant sworn out. He claimed, on evidence that Albert Kendrick had stolen a saddle and bridle from the livery in town some 3 weeks past. "That's a lie and you know it," Olive said, standing in her father's doorway with her arms crossed, while Albert, to his credit, did not so much as reach for his gun, only stood quiet and watchful beside the porch rail. "Lie or not, Miss Langley, I've a sworn complaint and a warrant, and I mean to see it served," Purdy said, his eyes sliding away from hers in a manner that told her everything she needed to know about how sincerely he believed his own paperwork. "Kendrick, you'll come along peaceable, or I'll have my men make it otherwise." Albert went in the end, peaceable as asked, because a fight in the yard would have served nobody, least of all himself, and Olive spent that long, furious night pacing her father's study while Warren Langley sat heavy and silent in his chair, the ledger open on the desk between them. "You knew," Olive said, not for the first time that evening. "You've known for a year that Purdy was bought, and you said nothing, because saying something might have cost you your cattle contracts. I have 100 families depending on this ranch for their wages, Olive," her father said, and for the first time in her memory, his voice held no anger at all, only a tired, worn honesty. "I told myself paying Vance's toll was the price of keeping them fed, and that fighting a corrupt marshal alone would only get good men killed for nothing. I was wrong to let it go on so long. I see that now, watching you do in a fortnight what I lacked the courage to do in a year." He looked up at her, and something in his weathered face had softened, though it had not broken. "What do you mean to do about Kendrick?" "I mean to get him out of that jail," Olive said, "and I mean to see this contract finished, and I mean to see Silas Vance and Amos Purdy both answer for every dollar they've stolen off decent people in this valley. And I would be grateful, Papa, if for once you stood beside me while I did it, instead of behind your desk." Warren Langley rose slowly from his chair, and for a long moment father and daughter simply looked at each other across the lamplit room, 2 stubborn people finally recognizing the same stubbornness in each other, and then he nodded, once, the way he might have sealed a cattle deal 30 years before. "All right," he said, "tell me what you need." What Olive needed in the end was patience she did not entirely possess, for it took 3 days of pressure from Constance Whitfield's second scathing article, from a dozen ranchers newly emboldened by the Ledger's public exposure, and from a visiting circuit judge who happened to be passing through Silver Bend on his usual route and took a sudden and pointed interest in the flimsy warrant against Albert Kendrick. Before Purdy was forced to release him for lack of any evidence beyond his own unsubstantiated word. But it was on the very morning of his release, before Olive had even reached the jailhouse door, that Albert Kendrick walked out a free man, collected his horse from the livery, and rode west out of Silver Bend without a word to anyone, leaving behind only a folded note delivered by the jailer's boy into Olive's hand. "Miss Langley," it read, in a plain, careful hand that she would come to know very well in the months and years after, "I have thought long on this while sitting in that cell, and I have decided the safest thing I can do for you, and for your father's contract, is to make certain Vance believes I have given up this fight entirely, so that his attention falls elsewhere while you finish what needs finishing. I mean to ride ahead and see what I can learn of his plans at the gate, and I mean to be there when your horses need me, but I cannot in good conscience stay in Silver Bend and watch you risk your name and your family's peace defending mine any further. You have already given more than I had any right to ask. Forgive a stubborn man his stubborn notions, and trust that I will not fail you when it matters most. Yours, Albert Kendrick. Olive read the note twice, and then a third time, standing alone on the jailhouse steps with the cold morning air biting at her cheeks, and felt a fury rise in her that surprised her with its intensity, not at Albert precisely, but at the impossible, aggravating, entirely typical foolishness of a man who thought riding off alone into danger was somehow a gift rather than a theft. "You great stubborn idiot," she said aloud, to no one. And then, because there was nothing else to be done with the feeling, she went to find her horse. The days that followed were among the strangest of Olive's life, for she found herself, in Albert's absence, discovering just how much of her heart he had quietly claimed without either of them ever having said so plainly. She organized the final drive with a fierce, restless energy, recruiting not only Tom and Cricket but 4 more ranch hands her father sent along without argument, and Dale Prout too, chastened now and eager to prove himself useful rather than merely resentful. She wrote to the commanding officer at Fort Grant, requesting an armed escort meet the herd at Coldwater Gate on the appointed day, a request that Warren Langley, newly resolved, backed with his own signature and his own reputation. She watched Constance Whitfield's 3rd article, naming Silas Vance outright as the man behind Purdy's corruption, spread through the territory on the strength of the ledger's evidence, until even the merchants who had once been too frightened to speak Vance's name aloud were gathering in the Sentinel's office to ask what could be done. And through all of it, in the quiet hours before sleep, Olive found herself thinking of a man riding alone through the mountains with nothing but his own stubborn courage for company, and understood, with the sudden clarity of someone who has been circling a truth for a long time before finally looking straight at it, that she loved him, plainly and entirely, and that she had perhaps loved him since the moment he drew a gun on Jessie Coyle from the far end of a snowy street without knowing her name. Albert, for his part, spent those same days doing exactly what his note had promised, riding the high trails around Coldwater Gate under cover of darkness, watching Vance's camp from a ridge with an old brass telescope he had carried since his stage-driving days, counting men and horses, and the crude timber barricade Vance's crew had begun building across the narrow bridge that marked the only crossing of the gorge. He confirmed what Halloran had warned them of. Vance meant to meet the horse drive at the gate itself, with a dozen armed men and the barricade to force a stop, and take whatever he pleased under the threat of guns, confident that no help would come, since the marshal who might have summoned it was the very man in his pocket. It was on the 4th night of his solitary watch, huddled in a rock crevice above the gorge with a cold wind cutting through his coat, that Albert allowed himself, for the first time since leaving Silver Bend, to think honestly about what he had walked away from. He had told himself he was protecting Olive by removing himself from the fight, by drawing Vance's attention toward an empty trail rather than toward the woman who mattered to him more than his own pride could easily admit. But sitting alone in the dark with only the wind and his own thoughts for company, he understood that he had also been protecting himself, in a smaller, more selfish way, from the terrifying vulnerability of loving someone as fully as he had come to love Olive Langley, someone whose loss would undo him far more thoroughly than his brother's death at this same gorge had already done. He thought of her in the creek, cold and determined, refusing to let go of a frightened horse even as the current dragged at her. He thought of her voice in the fire-lit line shack, admitting she was tired of being only the cattle baron's daughter. He thought of the particular, fierce light in her eyes when she had said she would not let Vance take her horses, and he understood, with the same plain certainty that had once told him to draw his gun on Coyle without a moment's hesitation, that he did not want to face the rest of his life without that light somewhere near him. He rode down from the ridge before dawn, made his way to a lonely crossroads store 2 days' ride from Silver Bend, where he knew the Langley drive would pass, and waited there through a long, cold morning until he saw the dust and the shapes of horses on the trail, Olive at their head on her steady mare, and something in his chest loosened for the first time in a week. She saw him before he had even fully dismounted, and she was off her own horse and crossing the frozen ground toward him with a speed that startled the men riding behind her. And when she reached him, she did not slap him, though he had half expected it, and she did not scold him either, not at first. She only stood in front of him, searching his face as if to confirm he was whole and unharmed. And then she said, in a voice rough with feeling she made no effort to hide, "You are the single most foolish, stubborn, self-sacrificing man I have ever had the misfortune to fall in love with, Albert Kendrick. And if you ever ride off and leave me a note again, instead of simply telling me to my face what fool notion you've got in your head, I will shoot you myself and save Vance the trouble." Albert looked at her for a long moment, snow beginning to fall lightly around them, and then he laughed, a real laugh, low and warm, the sound of a weight finally set down. "Fall in love with me," he repeated, as if testing the words. "That's so, Miss Langley." "That is so," Olive said, lifting her chin, though her eyes were bright with something more than the cold. "I don't say things I don't mean." "No," Albert said, "I don't suppose you do." He reached out, slow and careful, and cupped her cold face in his colder hands, and this time there was no wounded horse to interrupt them, no rushing water to demand her attention elsewhere. He kissed her there in the falling snow, gentle at first and then less gentle, and Olive Langley, who had drawn a gun without her hand shaking and ridden into a swollen creek without a second thought, found that she was shaking now, in an entirely different and far more pleasant way, as she kissed him back. "I love you too," Albert said, when they finally drew apart, his forehead resting against hers, his breath warm in the cold air. "Have done, I think, since you told me I favored my near-side rain too heavy and then went and did exactly as I said anyway." "I did not," Olive said, laughing despite herself, "do exactly as you said. You loosened the rein." "That was entirely my own decision." "Was it?" Albert said, smiling against her hair, and for a long moment neither of them said anything more, content simply to stand together in the quiet, falling snow, while behind them the horse strings shifted and stamped and the men waited with varying degrees of patience for whatever came next. What came next, of course, was Coldwater Gate, and the reckoning that had been building since a snowy morning in Silver Bend, when two strangers had drawn their guns on the same outlaw from opposite ends of a street. They reached the gorge on the appointed morning, 3 days before the 15th, the mountains rising sheer and white on either side of the narrow trail, the old timber bridge visible ahead where the gorge pinched down to its narrowest point, and across that bridge, exactly as Albert had scouted, stood Silas Vance himself, flanked by a dozen mounted men, with a crude barricade of felled logs blocking the far side of the crossing. Vance was not what Olive had expected somehow. She had pictured a man of obvious menace, but he sat his horse with the easy, almost bored posture of a businessman waiting out a tedious negotiation, a lean figure in a good black coat with silver-white hair beneath his hat and pale eyes that missed nothing. "Miss Langley," he called out, as the herd drew up short of the bridge at Albert's signal. "And Mr. Kendrick too, I see, looking considerably more alive than I'd been led to believe by certain reports. I do apologize for the inconvenience of the road, but I'm afraid there's a toll due on stock of this quality, and I mean to collect it." "There is no toll on this road, Vance," Albert called back, his voice carrying clear across the frozen air. "Not one the law recognizes and not one you'll be collecting today." "The law," Vance said and laughed, an unpleasant, dry sound. "Marshal Purdy might disagree with you there, Kendrick, seeing as he certified this crossing under my jurisdiction for the better part of a year now, official as anything." He nudged his horse a step closer. "Though I do hear Purdy's had a difficult week. Something about a ledger gone missing." His pale eyes settled on Olive with a flicker of genuine, cold interest. "I don't suppose you'd care to return that to me, Miss Langley, and save us all a good deal of unpleasantness." "The ledger's already been in front of a circuit judge," Olive said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage though her heart was hammering. "So has every article the Sentinel's printed about you and Purdy both. There isn't a rancher left in this valley who doesn't know what you've been doing to them, Mr. Vance, and there isn't a toll gate on God's earth that stays standing once enough decent people decide to tear it down together." Vance's smile did not falter, but something behind his eyes went flat and dangerous. Pretty words for a woman about to lose 11 fine horses at the end of a gun. It was then that the sound of many hooves rose from the trail behind them, and Olive felt a wash of relief so strong it nearly buckled her knees. For riding up the gorge behind the herd came not only her father, mounted stiff but determined on his old gray gelding, flanked by a dozen armed ranch hands and townsmen Constance Whitfield's articles had roused to action, but also, cresting the rise beyond them with blue coats bright even in the winter light, a column of cavalry from Fort Grant. Summoned by the letter Olive had sent a week before, arriving at the very hour they had promised. Vance's men shifted uneasily on the far side of the bridge, muskets and revolvers no longer feeling quite so decisive against a force that size, and Vance himself, for the first time, allowed something like genuine calculation to cross his face as he counted the newcomers. "You brought the army to a toll dispute," he said to Albert, almost admiring despite himself. "I brought the army to an armed robbery," Albert corrected, "which is what this is and what it's always been, however fine a word you dress it up in." He nudged his horse a step forward, placing himself deliberately between the herd and the bridge, unarmed hand raised, though his revolver remained ready at his hip. "You can ride off now, Vance, while there's still a road behind you to ride off on. Or you can hold that barricade and find out exactly how much protection a dozen frightened men are worth to you once they see a column of cavalry and a whole valley of ranchers standing against them." For a long, taut moment nothing happened at all, the two forces facing each other across the narrow bridge with only the sound of wind and shifting horses to fill the silence, and Olive found herself holding her breath, one hand resting near her own revolver, watching Vance's face for whatever decision was forming behind those pale, calculating eyes. It was Coyle, in the end, who broke first, wheeling his horse away from the barricade with a curse, and spurring off along a side trail without waiting for orders, and his defection seemed to loosen something in the rest of Vance's men, two more peeling away almost immediately, until Vance was left facing the assembled ranchers, cavalry, and one very determined fence rider with only half the force he had started the morning with. "This isn't finished," Vance said, though there was no real conviction left in it, only the bitter posturing of a man who knows he has lost. "It is for you," said a new voice, and Olive turned to see a cavalry officer, a captain by his insignia, ride forward with two troopers flanking him. "Silas Vance, I am placing you under arrest on the authority of the territorial governor's office, on charges of armed robbery, extortion, and conspiracy against a federal contract. Your martial friend has already been relieved of his badge in Silver Bend this very morning, on evidence provided by Miss Whitfield's newspaper and a ledger with his own initials in it. I would advise you not to make this more difficult than it already is." Vance looked once more at Olive, at Albert, at the assembled force arrayed against him, and then, with the particular grace of a man who understood when a game had ended, he raised his hands and let the troopers take his revolver, his barricade already being pulled apart by eager ranch hands even before he had finished being placed under guard. The bridge, when they finally led the herd across it an hour later, felt to Olive like something more than mere planks and timber. It felt like a gate that had been closed against decent people for a year finally swinging open, and she rode across it beside Albert Kendrick with a lightness in her chest that had nothing to do with the horses trailing behind them and everything to do with the man riding at her side. They delivered all 11 horses to the quartermaster at Fort Grant 2 days later, sound and unmarked as promised, and the colonel himself came out to inspect them, running an appreciative hand along the neck of the lead mare before signing the contract that would keep the Langley ranch solvent through the winter and well beyond. "Fine stock, Miss Langley," the colonel said. Finer than most I see offered these days. You ought to be proud." "I am," Olive said, and found, watching Albert unsaddle the last of the pack horses nearby with the easy competence of a man entirely at home in his work, that her pride had grown to include rather more than horses. Silver Bend, when they returned to it 3 days after that, was a changed town in small but meaningful ways. Amos Purdy had already fled the territory rather than face the charges piling up against him, and a new marshal, an honest, plain-spoken man named Foster who had ridden with the Fort Grant cavalry as a civilian scout, had been sworn in with the enthusiastic support of half the town's merchants. Silas Vance sat in the Fort Grant guardhouse awaiting transport to Tucson for federal trial, and Coyle, along with most of the scattered gang, had not been seen since the day at the bridge, though few in Silver Bend expected they would show their faces in that country again. Warren Langley, for his part, had undergone a quieter but no less significant change, and it showed itself most plainly on the evening Olive brought Albert to supper at the ranch house for the first time as something other than a hired hand. "I owe you an apology, Kendrick," Warren said, over coffee, in a voice that cost him some visible effort. "I fired a good man for having more courage than sense, and I did it because I was frightened, and I let that fear cost this family and this valley a year we might have spent fighting Vance instead of feeding him. I don't imagine I can undo that with a single supper, but I'd like to try to make it right if you'll let me." "I never held it against you for long, Mr. Langley," Albert said. "Man does what he thinks he must to protect what's his. I understand that better than most." He glanced at Olive, a small private warmth passing between them. "Though I will say, your fence lines likely suffered something terrible in my absence. North section posts were rotting through before I ever left." Warren laughed, a real laugh, the first Olive had heard from him in longer than she could easily remember. "Then I suppose I'd better hire you back if you're willing to have the job." "I'll take the job," Albert said, "on one condition." "Which is?" Albert set down his coffee cup and looked not at Warren but at Olive, and something in his steady gaze made her breath catch even before he spoke. "Your daughter tells me she means to expand this operation, once the cattle market rights itself. More breeding stock, more contracts like the one we just finished, deliveries not just to Fort Grant but to every fort and mining camp and remount station in the territory that'll pay a fair price for good horses raised honest. That's a fine notion, and it's going to need a man who knows every mile of dangerous road between here and the border, someone who can ride escort and read weather and keep a herd whole through whatever the country throws at it." He paused. "I'd like to be that man, Mr. Langley, same as I'd like to keep riding your fence line when I'm not on the road, if that arrangement suits you. But I mean to do it as Olive's partner in the horse business first, and your fence rider second, because there's a difference between the two now that matters to me more than any wage you could offer." Warren looked between the two of them for a long, considering moment, and Olive held her breath, though she thought she already knew, from the softness gathering at the corners of her father's eyes, what his answer would be. "I expect," Warren said slowly, "that arrangement will suit me fine, so long as it suits my daughter, since I've learned this past month that her judgment on matters that concern her own heart is rather better than my judgment on matters that concern anyone's protection money." He looked at Olive. "Does it suit you?" "It suits me," Olive said, "better than anything has in a very long time." They were married the following spring, in the yard of the Langley ranch house, with the first green coming up through the last patches of melting snow. Constance Whitfield writing up the whole affair for the Sentinel with more warmth than her usual reporting typically allowed, and Ezra Halloran writing in special from his lonely station to stand witness, declaring that he had not attended a wedding since his own 40 years before, and did not intend to wait another 40 for the next one. Olive wore her mother's old wedding ring, resized to fit her calloused, capable hand, and Albert wore a new coat that fit him considerably better than the travel-worn duster he had arrived in months before, though he confessed privately to Olive that he missed the old one's familiar weight. "We'll get you a new duster," Olive told him, as they stood together after the ceremony watching the sun break fully clear of the mountains for the first time in what felt like a very long winter, "seeing as you'll need it for the road." Fort Bowie's quartermaster wrote last week asking after more of the breeding stock, and there's a mining camp up past Copper Flat wanting mules for their freight line, and I have half a mind to say yes to both before the summer grass comes in. "Half a mind," Albert said, slipping his arm around her waist. "Or a whole one." "A whole one," Olive admitted, laughing. "Though I suppose I'll need a good trail hand who knows every dangerous mile between here and there if I mean to see it through safely." "Funny thing," Albert said, drawing her closer, the mountains gold and green behind them, the last of the snow retreating up the high slopes where it belonged. "I happen to know a man who fits that description exactly, and I hear he's recently come available, on account of he's found something worth staying for that's a good deal more important to him than any road he's ever ridden." "And what's that?" Olive asked, though she already knew the answer, had known it since a snowy street and a shared, silent understanding between two strangers who had drawn their guns on the same outlaw without a word passed between them. "You," Albert said simply, and kissed her there in the spring sunlight, with the ranch spread out around them and the road to every fort and mining camp in the territory open once more, safe and unafraid, for anyone brave enough and honest enough to travel it. They rode out together 3 weeks later on the first of what would become many drives, a dozen horses strung behind them bound for Fort Bowie's remount corral. And if the road still held its dangers, its washes and shelf trails and sudden mountain weather, it held them now for two people who had learned, in the hardest possible way, that the safest place in all that wild and beautiful country was simply beside each other, and that a stagecoach driver's knowledge of every dangerous mile meant a good deal less, in the end, than a cattle baron's daughter's steady hand upon the rein, and a fence rider's steady heart standing guard beside her, whatever storm came next.